All right, on my desktop, I went ahead and got a couple of images. And if you look in this file here, there's 4 images. I'm going to go ahead and set them up in this viewing manner. And what I have here are 4 images. This one here, when I roll my cursor over here, you can see that it's a JPEG. And this is the same file, but shot as an NEF. NEF is a camera raw format for Nikon. NEF stands for Nikon Electronic Format. It is the raw version. These 2 images were shot at the exact same fraction of a second, but the camera setting I had it on was raw plus JPEG fine. So let's start with what a camera raw image is. And what a camera raw image is when the light comes through your aperture, past the shutter and hits the sensor, it records. And so every light ray records on that photo sensor. Camera raw is the image as those light rays hit the sensor. Why is that important? Because it's recording it exactly the way you had the camera set up. So every detail, every light ray records on those pixels. When you shoot a JPEG, what happens is the camera takes those light rays, they come through the lens, they go past the shutter and they hit the sensor, but the camera goes ahead and processes them for you. And what it usually does is it sharpens the image a little bit. It looks at, I shouldn't say it looks, it determines the sort of tonal range, and it creates an image for you that it thinks is the best given those lighting conditions and things. So that is what a camera raw image, or that's what a JPEG is. It's a processed version of, it's your camera processing the light information that came through. Now, why is that important? Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look at these 2. So here is the JPEG image of this. And you can see it's a fine looking image. It's sharp here, it goes blurry here. Here is the raw version of it. And you can see it's a little more dull, not quite as sharp. It's because the camera took in the information and simply recorded as the light came in. Also, you'll notice up here, when I look at the raw version, it's an 8 megabyte file. If I look here at the JPEG version, it's a 1 megabyte file. That means that when it comes in as a raw image, it's a much larger image. It's recording a lot more information. It's not processing it. Also, a JPEG is what's called a lossy compression system, meaning that it takes in the information. In this case, it sort of processes it, it sharpens it a bit, it makes the contrast and highlights and shadows the way it reads the information, and then it sort of gets rid of some information. And the reason it does that is to make a smaller file size, and does that for a couple of reasons. One is bigger files take longer to process. So, you know, anything that you do to that image, it's going to take longer because it's working on a lot more information. So the JPEG just gets rid of some of the information it doesn't think it needs. Also, it doesn't have to store as much information. So your SD card doesn't fill up as quickly. If you're working on your computer, the files are smaller, so you can work on them more quickly. Also, if you're shooting things that you want in rapid succession, so if you're shooting if you're a sports photographer or something like that, you're probably not going to want to shoot raw images, because if you're trying to shoot a sequence, the raw images are much larger. So you may shoot and shoot and shoot, but the camera will eventually have to catch up. So it will have to stop at some point and finish processing and recording that information. So it doesn't allow you to do sort of the burst of shooting and things like that. But a raw image is extremely important if you plan on doing much post-processing to it. So if you want to come back and work on that image a raw image is crucial to have. Because like I said, a JPEG is lossy, so it's throwing out some information. A raw image is going to give you all the information that that sensor was able to capture. And then, capture, I hate the term capture, like we wrestle it to the ground and beat it up, it seems so violent, that sensor was able to record. So, you know, you can come back and you can make, it just gives you the ability to work with it much more. It gives you the ability to bring out different details in an image because all of the information is there. So that's basically what a raw image is. So as you can see with both of these, I was shooting these two cocktails, and the way I shoot is I'm tethered to my computer. So, and I don't shoot big bursts. I shoot one and I wait and change my angle or do something different. So on my camera, it has the ability to set it either just camera raw or just JPEG. It gives me different options for JPEGs. It gives me JPEG fine and normal and low. So it gives me different qualities of the JPEG depending on how big I want the files. Or it have a setting where it's camera raw plus JPEG. And so when I shoot, if I'm going to shoot camera raw, I usually shoot both of those, camera raw with a JPEG. Because if the JPEG looks fine, then I just go ahead and use those. But if there's something not right, if the lighting's not right, if there's something I want to bring out in the image, I may have to go back to that raw image and look for the detail or be able to process it. Okay, so that is what a raw image is. When do you shoot camera raw versus JPEG? That's going to be up to you depending on what you're going to do with it. Sometimes you have to think about how you're going to be using that final image. Like I said, we're going to be talking about file formats, and we're also going to be talking about not just JPEG, which is a compression system, so it makes smaller files and throws some information out, but also then when you take it into Photoshop and you decide to change the format of your files. There'll be different formats that will be for different uses, and some are lossy and some are non-lossy. So that is going to be a term we're going to be coming back to. And what that does is it's about file size. It's about file management. It's about the ability to store them. It's also about the ability to send them to other people and transfer information. And depending on what software program they're going to be using your images in, whether it's for a website, whether it's for print, all of those things will determine the size, the quality, and the format that you're going to want your final images in. So, you know, and if you're not sure where your final images are going to be, then often you will want to shoot raw images because you may have to come back to it and you're going to want that information. You're not going to want to make changes and then not be able to go back to that original information. So that's a quick intro to camera raw, why you would use it, and things to consider. So with that said, like you can see, I have these 4 images here. Now, when I take this whole folder and I move it into Bridge, so we looked at Bridge last week, and I have Bridge set up here for me, the way I use it. Remember that when using Bridge, when we open it, across the top, you're going to have some shortcuts up here. Across this bar is going to be the different names. So the way that the images lay out, I usually have mine in film strip mode, which is this. If you want to change the size of this window here, you can click and drag. So this is giving me my images. It's also showing me the names down here. But if I want the thumbnails bigger, I can drag them and make them larger. So again, we sort of went through all of this the other day. This should be sort of a quick recap. Over here, you know, is where the images are stored. So remember, Bridge is also about the ability to bring your images in, see them, get rid of the ones you don't want to deal with, you know, that are just bad or you just want to trash. It's also to rename them. We talked about using the rename tool. It's about the ability to file them into different files so we can move them into different files. We could set up more files. So that's what Bridge is for. It's really an organizational way of dealing with your images. Bridge also allows you to do a few other things. So as you can see down here, I have JPEGs and RAW files of both of these. So let me go ahead and click on the NEF. That's the Nikon electronic. That is Nikon's raw version here. And so that's Nikon's raw version right there. Over here in the shortcuts, you'll see that this little icon that looks like a camera lens, it says open in camera raw. If I click on that, it's going to open that image. So that is my NEF file. And then over here, it's going to give me this whole panel of sliders. This is what the camera raw setup looks like. And over here now is where we can start to manipulate the image. Now, here's the important thing. When we're working in camera raw, you are not actually changing the pixel information. So we aren't actually changing the image itself. Bear with me because this is a little hard to understand. Your image, when it's in raw format, is just there. All the information is there. When we come over here to the sliders, what we're doing is we're asking it to look at this image in a different way. And what it's going to do is it's going to take the information there and it's going to write a set of instructions to say, oh, we want to see it with this. So in the case of up here, first thing is white balance. So you'll notice this thing that says as shot. If I click over here, you'll see that it gives me some different options. Auto is to let it change it to what it thinks it is. And you can see that it warmed it up. It gave it a little bit more yellow. But if I go to different things, if I say, oh, I want to see what it looks like under daylight, see how much more yellow red it makes the image? Or a cloudy day, or I shot it in shade. What it's trying to do is to color correct the white balance. And what that means is, we haven't talked about lighting yet. And when we talk about lighting, we're going to talk about different colors of light and how they will affect your image. But for right now, just understand that white balance is an attempt to make the whites in your image white without a color cast. So a true white. So right now, this image over here is probably the whitest area, and I see a little bit of what looks like blue or cyan. Cyan is a lighter color of blue. We'll see that when we start talking about color. But this was shot with a mobile strobe unit, which should be balanced for white light. But there was a little bit of sunlight coming in, which when the sunlight comes in, then it adds a little blue cast to it. So I could try to get rid of that. And I could either go through these different selectors like, oh, I was shooting under daylight. And you can see how it sort of adds some yellow red to that image. That's a little too much for me. I can also come down here to the custom slider and go, oh, you know what? Let me go here to as shot. I can come down here to the custom slider. Oops, what happened? And I go, you know what? I want it a little cooler, or I want it a little bit warmer. So I can use this slider here, or I can change the tint of it. Oh, it needs a little more green, or it needs a little more magenta. So I have those sliders available to me. I'm just going to go back to as it was shot. Also down here, you'll notice this group of sliders: exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. I can change the exposure. It's a good exposure, but if I wanted to increase the exposure a little bit, you can see here how increasing that exposure is going to add detail. It lightens everything up. This side gets way too light. Now, these were bad shots. That's why they're here, because they basically were thrown away. They weren't used. But you can see how I start to lose detail in this highlight. I start to get more detail in the shadow and things like that. But even though my exposure was correct in the camera, there are times that you may want to change your exposure. Remember, a brighter image is going to seem happier and sunnier. If I went the other way, I can make a darker image, which seems more brooding, and hence the term darker, a little less nice, a little meaner. So, you know, you'll also notice that there's a range of exposures that would be considered okay, depending on creatively what you want to do with them. So, you know, again, when we change the slider, it's just saying, oh, I want to see it at a higher exposure. It's not actually changing the pixel information. I'll show you, maybe you'll understand that here in a second. And again, the contrast, I can either decrease the contrast or increase my contrast. Contrast is the difference between the blacks and the whites in the image. So the dark areas and the light areas in a color image. And the higher the contrast, the more there is just dark and light without much tonal range in between. So as I increase this image, the contrast, you'll see that it goes dark, and here the highlights start to lose detail, the dark areas start to lose detail. If I lessen the contrast, you'll see that I start to bring detail into the highlights and the shadows, but everything seems a little flatter. So, you know, depending on what you want to do with your image, there's that. Then in Camera Raw, you have the ability to just increase the highlights or decrease the highlights and the shadows as well. So we can, so right here you can see how the dark areas, I can lighten just those up, and I can darken the highlight areas. So again, it's similar to altering the contrast. I can also then change the white point. So where things fall off into white. So where things get lighter or darker. And the same thing with the blacks, where the black point is, where things go black or where those blacks lighten up. So that is that group of sliders. And those are all about just dealing with the exposure and contrast of your image. As we go down here, you'll notice texture. Well, let me go back. So right now, I want to go back to where I started. I don't like the changes I've made. So I can go here to reset to where I open, and I'm just going to go ahead and hit that. And you'll notice it takes all those sliders back to where I opened the image. So let me just go ahead and make some couple of quick changes here. Lessen the contrast a little bit. All right, now down here, this next group of sliders, these three, texture, clarity, and dehaze, are more about sharpening your image. So when we go into Photoshop, next week I think it is, we'll talk more about different tools that Photoshop has. Now, when we work in Photoshop, the difference is going to be that we're actually changing the pixel information. We're changing the image itself. Right now, when we're working in Camera Raw, we are just asking to see the image in a different way. We're just asking to see the pixels handled in a different way. So right up here, texture, when I increase that, it looks like it's sharpening, and it kind of is. What it's doing is, see how it's adding detail to some of these areas here? And clarity does the same thing. Now, what they're actually doing, I'm sure you could read about it, and it will give you some algorithm that it's using, the difference between texture and clarity, but I just know that they sharpen it. Texture tends to not do as much. Clarity is sort of the big sweep. Texture is more sort of the detail. Dehaze is interesting because it's sort of removes this, it's like you clean the windshield. It's almost like there's a haze, a sort of white film across the top, and it just sort of helps to get rid of it. So again, how that algorithm works in Photoshop or in Camera Raw, I'm not sure, but you can see what it starts to do. So there's that, those three sliders there allow me to do that. And then down here, vibrance and saturation are very similar. So saturation, if I were to slide that, just increases the color of each pixel. So it just intensifies it. And if I go the other way, it will turn it into a black and white image. So you see how it gets rid of all the color. It keeps the tonal range, but it gets rid of the color. So vibrance just does a lesser version of that. It sort of just deals with the highlight and the shadows and sort of leaves the midtones alone. So I could make an image that looks something like that. Now, I really don't like the way this image was shot. I had to change it because the light was bad on it. But you can see how it changes that image. Now, if I want to see what it looked like when I started, oh, that just took me back to where it was when we started. So this toggles back and forth. So that's what the image looks like when I brought it in. Here it is with the changes that I've made. I can also look at the image from where I started to here's where the changes I've made. I can switch these around, changes I've made to where I've started, or I can put them half and half on here. So there's different ways you can work with gives me the before, the before and after. Go back here. I just reset all my settings. So, okay. So let me go ahead and set this up. I hate this working with Zoom because all my fingers don't work correctly in here. Okay, so all right, so let me go ahead and make some changes to this. So as shot, I'll increase the exposure a little bit. I'll increase the contrast. I'll lessen my highlights, increase my shadows, take my whites down. My blacks, I'll make a little blacker. I'll increase the texture, the clarity. I'll dehaze it a bit. I'll increase the vibrance, but lessen the saturation a touch. And if I hit cancel, again, it will go back. But if I hit done, what happens now is it takes me back to bridge. And you'll notice now on this icon, I get this little other icon right above it. Even if I go to another image, it stays there. What that's telling me is that I have made changes in camera raw. So if I click on this and I go back, it's going to take me back to where I had those sliders and everything set. So it's told me that I've made changes to it. And that's great. That's where, you know, but it hasn't changed the pixel information. And so let me show you what I mean by that. If I go to my desktop and I open this raw folder, you'll notice that it's added something down here. Can everybody see that? Do you see this window that I have here? Yeah, okay. So see this thing that now, here was the JPEG, here was the NEF. See this thing now that says XMP? What that is a series of instructions it wrote to handle the camera raw file. So it said, oh, look, I want to change these things on it. When you show me that image, you know, you'll even see here, the vibrance, plus 20, you know, all the little things here that I changed, the midtones, is a whole set of instructions written for that. If I take those instructions and I throw them in my trash, now I go back to my image over here in Bridge. You'll notice how there's no instructions written for it anymore. The image goes back to where I originally had it shot. That image always existed exactly as I had it shot. It just had a set of instructions written to view it. So that is the difference between working in camera raw and dealing with your image versus if I were to now, let's go ahead and work with it again in camera raw. If I made changes to it, and instead of just hitting done and is that? Oh. And having the instructions written for it, if I were to go from camera raw, if I were to hit open, what it's going to do is it's going to launch Photoshop for me. So does everybody see up here in the upper left-hand corner now how it says Photoshop? What it's done is it's opened the Photoshop software. You'll notice that it's saying, oh, here's this image. It's now in Photoshop. I have this toolbox over here, and over here I have a whole, it's a different window. We haven't talked about Photoshop yet, but this allows me to look at my image in Photoshop. It brings it into Photoshop, but also now, if I make any changes, I'm not just writing instructions for how to view that image. What I'm doing is now I'm going to actually change the pixels. Once it brings it into Photoshop, now it's made the changes so that set of instructions have been applied to this image. This image exists now. Each of these pixels have information written to them that is making them look this way. If I were to come up here and make any changes, so if I wanted to and you'll see a lot of the same sort of sliders in Photoshop. So if I want to increase the exposure or decrease my exposure, I can do that here. If I wanted to change my levels, which we're going to talk about, or the curves, I could do that. So any changes I make here, if I decide to go ahead and desaturate the whole image, make it darker or lighter, I'll do that. And now when I go to File, Save, you'll notice it immediately comes up as not an NEF anymore, as a JPEG. If I were to hit Save this now, it's going to ask me if I want to replace that other JPEG version I have of this. So I don't want to do that. So you want to make sure that you're not overriding that other image. So I'm going to call this one black and white JPEG. It's going to go into the raw demo folder, and I'm going to go ahead and hit Save. It's going to ask me the quality, and I hit OK. Now, when I close this window down, when I look in that raw demo folder, you'll notice that I have the black and white image that I just, the BW image that I just created. Here was the other JPEG that I had. Here was my original raw file. Here is the new set of instructions I had written. So all of those exist. If I'm to look into, if I go back to Bridge, you'll see that it's there. You'll also see that the original NEF file is here with the camera raw instructions written for it. So again, it's a little, and I'm not as clear as I'd like to be, but I want you to understand that when we deal with actually altering the pixels, it's as if you wrote a manuscript and you said, oh, and you started to actually erase things and change the words. That's like dealing with something in Photoshop. You've erased an area, you've put in new words, and now you can never go back to where the way you wrote it originally. But if you were to put a piece of plastic on it and sort of make changes to it and sort of look and go back and forth and like, oh, I don't like that one, and then sort of wipe those off and put new ones on, that's what dealing in camera raw is. Your original manuscript is there, but the ability to sort of look at it, go back and forth, change it, not change it, but you never alter the original versus erasing it, making changes, and then saving those. That's kind of the difference between working in camera raw versus when you take something into Photoshop. Also now, once we go into Photoshop and we save it as something else, now we've written a new file. We've got another version of it here. More to store, all of that's going on. So that is basically the difference between working with Camera Raw and then taking it into Photoshop and making changes. You are changing it and you're making another version of it. Again, it's going to take up storage space on your computer. Working with the Camera Raw file is going to be larger than working with the JPEG. Once you make it a JPEG, you've lost some of the information. You can't go back to that original amount of information. So, you know, again, considering how to work with Camera Raw or not. Now, another amazing thing that Bridge allows you to do is to take your raw files, which are in this case NEF files. Now, NEF, like I said, is the Nikon version of a raw file. Canon calls theirs, I think, CR2s or something like that, which is the Canon raw file. Sony, I don't even know what Sony calls theirs, but a lot of cameras have the ability to write raw. What Bridge can do now is DNG. See over here where it says export to DNG? DNG is the standard digital negative file. So why is that important? It's just the standardized version, so that if you're dealing with in a group of people using different kinds of computers or different software programs, things like that, sometimes they just want a digital negative. And you know, some Camera Raw processors don't deal well with Nikon, or they don't deal well with Canon. So what they've come up with is sort of the standardized negative, and that's called a DNG. That's what people, you know, well, it's just the standard. So if I wanted to take my NEF file here of this cocktail, I can click and drag it over here to export to DNG. See how that blue line's come up? Once I drop it in there, it says one job, one file. Down here, it'll say start export. I haven't done that yet. Let's say I want to do both of these. So I drag this one in there too. I could go through and choose whichever ones I wanted to. And now when I hit start export, you'll notice that it's exporting two files. I'm going to go ahead and close that up. Now, where did it export them to? All right. If I go back to my raw file, does everybody see my desktop now? The little mountains? Does everybody see the raw demo file over here? So if I double click on that now, you will see that it added a file down here that's called DNG. If I open that, it's taken those two files and now it's created DNG versions of them. So now it's gone ahead and just made standardized digital negatives that I can work with. And like I said, if you're just working on your own, you don't need to do that necessarily. If you're working in a group, if you're going to be sending them out, a lot of times, you know, artists might want to send them out to have their work printed or done different things with them. Then you might want to write DNGs. And a lot of, if you take Mia's class, she converts all, just as you bring them into the computer, you convert from whatever raw format you're in into DNG. So people work with them in different ways, but that is what Bridge allows you to do. It allows you to handle those files, to work with them either in Camera Raw, right in Bridge, then to take them seamlessly into Photoshop, or to translate them into DNG files, which then you can store and save as your own digital negatives. Now, when I go ahead and, let me go ahead and drag this back into Bridge. Let me make sure that I'm sharing my Bridge file with you. So as I drag this back into Bridge, if I went ahead and made any other changes. So now let's say that I wanted to start with this image as a black and white image. So I'm just going to go ahead and desaturate the image, and I'm going to go ahead and look at it here. I'm going to increase the contrast, bring the highlights down a little bit. I'll bring the shadows up. And I'm going to increase all of this. And I go ahead and open this one in Photoshop now. All right, so you should see this image now in Photoshop. So I went ahead and made changes to it, and I'm going to go ahead and go to my Photoshop file here. So I'm in Photoshop. Up here in the upper left-hand corner, it's telling me it's Photoshop. You know, I love Photoshop. It's an incredible thing to use. Watch, this is called the healing brush. I don't like all those little dots in there. I just go ahead and click on them. The computer automatically looks around and it just seamlessly makes the changes for me. Yeah, I could spend a little more time on that. But if I don't like this up there, I can get rid of it. All right, I can spend hours cleaning up images. It's what I often do. Also allows me to dodge and burn areas. We'll come back and we'll be taking a look at doing some of that sort of thing to your images. But what I'm trying to show you is that once I make these changes to this, now when I go here, I can either go to File, Save, and you can see it's going to replace that other JPEG version. I don't want that. So I could either rename it. So I could call it Black and White 2. If I just called it BW, it would try to replace this one. But here's what you're going to want to use a lot. Save as. So save as, let's go ahead and call it BW2. Now, it's going to save it into that raw folder for me. And you can see here's all the stuff in my raw folder. And it's also going to give me all these different formats that I can choose from to save that image. So I can save it as a JPEG. I could save it as a Photoshop document, which means if I want to come back and work on it just as a Photoshop document, if I've created layers or done anything to it, I go ahead and save it as a PSD, which is where I often save my images just as a Photoshop document because I'll come back and work on them. If I go to JPEG, it's going to flatten everything out. Again, it's a lossy compression system. Photoshop's going to save things as they are. Then these others, EPS, JPEG, I use Photoshop PDF. I'll talk about when I do that. Very rarely Photoshop RAW for anything. But you can see there's this other one down here, though, called TIFF. TIFF is a format that a lot of people save to. It's a non-lossy system, so it saves much like a Photoshop document, but it's a more cross-platform format. So I'm going to show you the file formats here in a couple of minutes. So you can see that you have all these options from which to save your image, how you want to save it. So that's up to you. I'm just going to go ahead and save this as a Photoshop document. And when I hit save, it will go ahead and save it into that raw demo folder for me. You'll also see that it has the title here across the top, the image as I just saved it. Here was the other one that I had saved, but here's the one that I just did. All right, so that's thinking about how to use Bridge to take your images into Photoshop. Now, again, I just saved another version of this. So now I'm going to have, I don't know how many files in there, 6 files. So you see how they keep building on each other. I could have different versions, all of that kind of stuff. But this isn't a set of instructions now. This is saved this as this pixel information. And I'll be talking more about that when we bring things into Photoshop and look at them, but understanding that difference. Camera raw keeps the image as you shot it and just gives you viewing instructions. When you take it into Photoshop now, you're actually changing the pixel information and you're seeing now altered pixels on that canvas. So that's the important part to understand. So again, you know, I give you a sort of quick intro into these things. I don't tell you everything that is available there. I do hope that it gives you enough information to start sort of exploring some of these things, to try some things out, to help you understand them a little better and to get you going in that direction. But so let me see here. I'm trying to talk and work. I'm not a good multitasker. I'm going to go ahead and share this with you. So here on the home page, what I just talked about, there is this information. So if I'm not clear, if you want to go back over it, here's some little blurbs on camera raw, how to change your camera to shoot camera raw. And you want to check your camera and see what kind of settings it might have on it as well. Things to think about with raw images, sort of what the processor already takes care of for you in the camera sometimes, versus, you know, when you shoot camera raw, you are going to need to process it. You can't just take it right off your camera and put it onto Instagram or, you know, into other pages or something. When you shoot with camera raw, it means you're adding a step. You're going to have to do something with that. So again, a little thing about why you shoot raw versus JPEG, what's the right times for that. And then here into the quiz, which is not the part that I wanted to go to. Also, down here, if you want to understand those file formats that I was talking about with Photoshop, here is a little blurb on all of them. So when you would save with a PSD folder, so that's just if you're working in Photoshop and its thing, talks about digital negatives, JPEGs, remember the difference between lossy and non-lossy compression systems, GIFs, PNGs, TIFF, I talked a little bit about, but again, you know, you're gonna want to know sometimes what you're gonna be doing with your images. So again, if you shoot in RAW, it gives you the ability to manipulate those images and then save them in different file formats. Because, you know, if you're sending images to somebody that's just going to be using them on a website, they're going to need them at a certain resolution or in a certain format that they want. If you're sending it to a printer, they're going to want a certain format. If you're working with a designer that's going to be using them in some other software program, they may be asking for a different format. So all of those things are, you know, depends on what you're doing, on how you're going to use them. So again, that's the quick intro to camera raw, why you might want to think about it, how you might want to use it, and things to consider with that.